Hello and welcome to America and the Left, a panel hosted by the Platypus Affiliated Society at UC San Diego. My name is Colin and I help run the chapter at UCSD. The Platypus Affiliated Society was established in December in 2006. It organizes reading groups, public fora, research, and journalism focused on the problems and tasks inherited from the old 1920s to 30s, new 60s to 70s, and post-political 80s to 90s left for the possibility of emancipatory politics today. Our chapter holds a weekly discussion group on contemporary topics Tuesday afternoons at 5 p.m. at Mom's Cafe. We also host a reading group, Introduction to Revolutionary Marxism, Wednesday evenings at 6 at Groundwork Books. These are open to students and the public. If you're interested in hearing more, please find Dustin or Drew after the event has ended. I will be moderating the event tonight. Each of our panelists has been invited to present an opening statement, which will be capped at 13 minutes. They will then have 3 minutes to respond to one another in the same order as they present. The rest of our 2-hour slot will be devoted to audience Q&A. Sometime between 7:45 and 8:15, we will conclude the panel. For those that wish to continue the discussion, I encourage you to join us downstairs at Dirty Bird's Bar and Grill afterwards. And I will now introduce our panelists in the order that they are speaking. Minnal, on my right, is a member of the American Communist Party. Martin Eder grew up in Colombia, in South America. He was a rank-and-file union organizer who worked in an iron foundry and construction before becoming a high school teacher, and later a college and university instructor of sociology. He is the founder and director of KNS Justice Radio, which broadcasts on 89.1 FM. On his right, Dr. Mychal Odom is an assistant professor of Black Studies at San Diego Mesa College and a contributor to Burning Spear newspaper, the oldest Black power newspaper in continuous print and the official organ of the African People's Socialist Party. Park is a university student and co-founder of Young Democratic Socialists of America at UC San Diego. The prompt for today's discussion is, the left has a troubled history with the concept of the nation. While the right reasserts American sovereignty, many leftists have condemned America as the great imperial power. The relation of the left to America calls into question the ideals of both. When was America revolutionary? Do its wrongs invalidate its spirit? What is its role in the global struggle for freedom? You ready?
Yep. Hello. So my name is Minnal with the American Communist Party. I want to thank the Platypus Society again for inviting us to speak here. So what I'm going to try and do is lay out some of the history of the American Revolution. We believe that the American Revolution was one of those great revolutions in history. To say that it inspired a number of revolutionaries and subsequent progressive developments around the world would be an understatement. We in the ACP believe that it was indeed a people's revolution, not one without contradictions, but nonetheless a people's revolution. This understanding was actually quite clear to progressive thinkers in the 1800s, but now it has become extremely contentious. How can we understand this phenomena and what must be done about it? The American Communist Party, as a Marxist-Leninist party, seeks to understand a thing by looking at not just the thing, but its past, its development, and its forward trajectory. So I hope to demonstrate in this speech that the American Revolution is not just worth defending, but a requirement of the left today in America. To accomplish this, we will apply the standard Marxist paradigm of historical materialism and trace the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary currents of America over time. It is clear that the founding fathers of America were inspired by a variety of political thinkers and revolutionaries before them. This influence can be traced through Oliver Cromwell to the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights written in 1689. Various pamphlets by John Adams, James Otis, and others make explicit references to this revolution as establishing the sovereignty of the peoples and limits on monarchy. The First Continental Congress of America in 1774 made various references to this Bill of Rights as well. Did the founding fathers scoff at the Glorious Revolution and deny its progressive kernel even though it left the monarchy intact? No. They recognized the revolutionary strand of development within it and developed their own position as a true sublation of it. This should be our perspective as well. So discussing the American Revolution in particular, there are a number of qualities within it that are praiseworthy. The American Revolution was the first time a colony successfully broke from the British rule for an extended period of time. Its aspirations were lofty, claiming all men were created equal and had inalienable rights, and among those were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The idealistic aspirations of the revolution were, of course, in contrast to the incompleteness of the revolution. Obviously, these ideals were not materially realized for all those living in America, including slaves, women, and indigenous peoples. Nonetheless, the Founding Fathers often wrote against these enterprises, made perhaps most clear in Washington's farewell address. The contradiction of many of the Founding Fathers having slaves and participating in these exploitive practices, yet often writing against slavery and for its eventual abolition, should not be dismissed as simple hypocrisy. Instead, we should understand this contradiction dialectically, that the process of abolition and progress does not happen immediately, but over the protracted series of conflicts and struggles. One of the first landmarks of the counter-revolution post-American Revolution, after 1776, was the Jay Treaty of 1794. Now, the Jay Treaty officially declared that it sought to resolve outstanding disputes with Britain and secure American neutrality. However, what it concretely did is that it re-anchored the United States in a commercial and diplomatic posture favorable to Britain. It did this by compelling the United States to honor pre-revolutionary debts to British creditors, by agreeing to British definitions of neutral rights that allowed continued seizure of American ships trading with France, and by permitting Britain to maintain restrictive limits on American commerce in the West Indies, and by accepting British forts and influence on the western frontier. This all culminated in the War of 1812, where the United States attempted to fully rupture with the British Empire, confronting the grievances of the Jay Treaty yet left unresolved. The British naval imprisonment of American sailors, interference with neutral trade, and ongoing military presence and influence on the western frontier all coordinated to create the grounds for this war. From there, the long trajectory of the unfinished revolution leads to the American Civil War. This war dealt with one of the deepest contradictions left unresolved in 1776, the coexistence of free Republican ideology, of equality, and existence with proliferation of a slaveholding oligarchy. The Confederacy represented a fully articulated counter-revolutionary project and received significant material support from the British in the form of raiding vessels such as the CSS Alabama and Florida, as well as diplomatic support in the form of British aristocratic sympathy. We are lucky to have a significant number of pamphlets by Marx and Engels on the Civil War that help explain it. As they say, the question of the principle of the American Civil War is answered by the battle slogan with which the South broke the peace. Stevens declared the Secession Congress that now for the first time slavery was recognized as an institutional good in itself and as the foundation of the whole state edifice. Whereas the revolutionary founding fathers, men steeped in the prejudices of the 18th century, had treated slavery as an evil import from England, set to be eliminated in the course of time. Similarly, they discussed the effects of this counter-revolution on the existing white population as well. For the oligarchy of 300,000 slaveholders utilized the Congress of Montgomery not only to proclaim the separation of the South from the North, it exploited it at the same time to revolutionize the internal constitutions of the slave states, to completely subjugate the section of the white population that had still maintained some independence on the protection and democratic constitution of the Union. Between 1856 and 1860, the political spokesmen, jurists, moralists, and theologians of the slaveholders' party had already sought to prove not so much that Negro slavery is justified, but rather that color is a matter of indifference and the working class is everywhere born to slavery. Most famously in this time period is Marx's letter to Lincoln congratulating him on his re-election, where he says, "The working men of Europe feel sure that as the American War of Independence initiated a new era of ascendancy for the middle class, so the American anti-slavery war will do so for the working classes. They consider it an earnest of the epoch to come that it fell to the lot of Abraham Lincoln, the single-minded son of the working class, to lead his country through the matchless struggle for the rescue of an enchained race and the reconstruction of the social world. Following the Second American Revolutionary War comes the failure of the Reconstruction era. Yet again, Britain played an indirect but relevant role here as British textile capital re-entered the Southern economy on favorable terms. They purchased vast quantities of cheap cotton produced by sharecropping and debt peonage, which replaced slavery but preserved the economic logic. London banks also and investment houses financed southern railroads, plantations, and urban infrastructure, stabilizing the power of the old planter class under new legal forms. Similarly, the British elites embraced the New South narrative, treating the region as an attractive area for imperial investment, as black labor was politically unprotected and economically coerced. Skipping ahead, the counter-revolutionary capitalist classes finally consolidated themselves during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, coinciding with Lenin's famous text on imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. This text aptly predicted the financialization of the capitalist system, which was fully consolidated after World War II under Harry Truman. While Wilson had first tied American finance, diplomacy, and military power to the British-centered Atlantic system, Truman made this permanent. With FDR's death and the end of the New Deal, Truman moved to deep alignment with Britain. The Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946 restored the City of London's financial centrality, and the Truman Doctrine formally shifted the US into Britain's former imperial spheres in Greece and Turkey, and provided the pretext for future American interventions. Similarly, the Marshall Plan and general agreements on tariffs and trades indebted European economies and made them dependent on the US. In this way, the modern rules-based order, or Western imperialism in other words, was cemented and the counter-revolution was effectively complete. It is roughly at the same time that Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech in 1956. What followed from Khrushchev's speech in America was a general realignment of the existing US left, which was led not by a single organization, but a constellation of figures and groups breaking with Stalinism and reorienting towards democratic socialism, Trotskyism, left communism, and so on. It is with these tendencies that out of this springs a line of thought antagonistic to the American Revolution, attempting to rethink it as a reactionary tendency, settler colonial, anti-black, and so on. So while I will leave out the future developments of the American economy, which include the Bretton Woods Agreement and so on, I hope that I've adequately laid out enough of the historical development of the revolutionary and counter-revolutionary trends in the United States. With that in mind, I believe the correct orientation of the American left is to defend the American Revolution as one of those truly revolutionary movements, and to recognize this revolution as incomplete. We in the American Communist Party believe that it is Marxism-Leninism that is only adequately able to solve this riddle of history. While the Founding Fathers were trapped in the idealism of their times and were unable to realize their aspirations, we now know that it is Marxism that is necessary to truly realize these aspirations and fulfill these bourgeois revolutions, converting them into proletarian revolutions. I hope this speech can spark some discussion among the American left, and I invite any and all criticism. As Marxists, we are always trying to sharpen our theoretical line. Thank you.
Put this behind you or okay. Good evening. My name is Martin Eder. I'm speaking on behalf of Liberation Road, which is a national socialist organization. First and foremost, I'm fascinated by all of you here discussing this kind of issue. In a certain sense, I sat in your place when I was 19 years old, beginning my resistance to capitalism and to imperialism. The Vietnam War was the issue of the day, was the genocide of the day, and one that forced those of us of my age to make a decision about what we were going to do with our lives. In the sense, first of all, there was a draft, and all young men had to register for that draft. Well, at first it began, if you were in college, you got an automatic class privilege not having to register. It was a significant movement to have, something other than the poverty draft. That said, at a certain point in college, when Richard Nixon invaded Cambodia, we had the largest national student strike of the time. The university was shut down right at finals time, and something like 700 different colleges and universities went on strike and shut down the university system as something that never happened. And at that point, I said, I'm withdrawing from the university until this war is over. It's inconsistent with my moral stance to be pretending that I'm studying for a future in an America that is ended up killing 4 million people in Southeast Asia. I say this to give a little bit of background about how I come to this, the question, and came around to feeling the necessity to be a revolutionary, to be a person committed first to the people's struggle and to joining the people's struggle in all of its complications. And at that time, those of us in the revolutionary left, we used to call ourselves the New Communist Movement. I kind of wonder sometimes whether how new we really were, but we resisted the collaboration of those left parties that were working with the Democratic Party and working with the war machine, something that's going on today. The context in which that's relevant is that right now we face extraordinary challenges, not since really the Civil War or the Great Depression have we as Americans faced the imminent counter-revolution. A comrade here just talked about, the period of Reconstruction that lasted and gave, black power in the South some teeth and some legislative things, and there was a counter-revolution against that. Right now we're facing everything that we have fought for over the last 50 or 70 years is being challenged. Women's rights, civil rights, human rights, economic equity, dangerous words like diversity, equity, and equality. This is a counter-revolution that all of us have to decide to oppose. And the primary contradiction at this point in the United States is between those people that have some semblance of a strong support for the democratic ideals of the country, of the U.S., in its promise, particularly in the Declaration of Independence, the promise of the Constitution, of we the people, but also with the recognition that U.S. corporate dominance, the ruling class, has been built on white supremacist, nationalist oppression from day one. And this sets us apart from many other countries of the world to be part of a settler state and have the ingrained, those that are said to have founded the country on somebody else's land, the taking and the stealing of indigenous lands, as the original sin of this country. a sin that is based in the supremacy of white Europeans coming and discovering land that already belonged to peoples and cultures, vast cultures in this. So when I think about as Liberation Road, when I think about, what was it that was fought for in 1776, in the founding of this republic, it's really to recognize that revolution, as was said, was a bourgeois revolution. In other words, it was a revolution of those who were against colonialism. The primary contradiction at that time was a struggle against colonialism. It was successful in terms of being able to get rid of the exportation of a lot of the surplus profit that was being made to the empire of Great Britain, of England. But it failed to recognize that what I had just talked about is white supremacy and the degree to which the oppression of peoples of color, the oppression of native nations, of the black nation, that led to the stealing of half of Mexico and the conquest of that Mexico, something that we're living every day as we see, who is in and around, and the counter-revolution that is being fought against immigrants whose DNA has been on this continent, for millennium, being called illegal immigrants, being called by the very people who in fact stole that half of Mexico, and that went on to colonizing Puerto Rico, to the conquest, the stealing of a great nation of Hawaii. Tell me where I am in time. 4.5 minutes. Okay, thank you. The purchase of native peoples in Alaska, that were up for sale, and the taking of their land. So this great pillar of capitalism and the failure of the American Revolution to deal with it was based on white supremacism. And I would say to you that the basis of fascism's return in the United States right now, we have that same class of white supremacists in the White House signaling that we want a white majority back in power. And so it's our obligation, really, to recognize that the class struggle in the United States is integrally tied with the issue of racial oppression. So from the very beginning, the colonialist mentality was not conquested. It actually became part of the fabric of the building of this country. The colonialist mentality of taking not only native lands, but the importation of African peoples, the conquest, as we said, of Mexican lands and the taking, but also the part of the revolution that took a long time for us to do, and that is, to give, at least in voice, equality to women in terms of the franchise, in terms of the ability of votes, to not just be for white landowners. The most important part, I think, is what do we need to do today based on those realities. We need to continue the revolution and that part which has been undone. The Reconstruction period of the Civil War, which which acknowledged the right of the peoples to self-determination in the Black Belt South in particular, that was overthrown. That counter-revolution needs to be forwarded, needs to be reversed right now, and it is on the table. So what do we need to do? We need to build a united front that's able to defeat fascism. The controversial part of that is that we have to unite the many to defeat the few. And what does that mean? It means that we are going to have to work with some people that we later recognize as being part of a secondary contradiction. You know, the primary contradiction is against what we like to call in Liberation Road the new Confederacy. That's who we think is in the White House. The MAGA forces is the new Confederacy. We need to unite with all of those who are opposing that, and that includes people in the Democratic Party. It includes some of the leading people, like the Squad. 1 minute. We also need, among the left, to be working more in unison with each other than we are right now. To build this united front, we need to be able to work together. And socialist organizations, you know, I particularly want to call out the DSA as being, you know, extraordinary with 80,000 members. We need to, you know, put that onto the agenda. And lastly, something I'll put out that I think is going to be controversial is that the only way right now, at this moment, to defeat fascism, well, I won't say the only, the primary way it's going to be defeated is through the elections. That's not what we want when we have a two-party monopoly and a two-party dictatorship. But we have to, as left, swallow the hard pill and recognize that we have to be part of these elections in order to get to the next stage of the class struggle. Thank you. I appreciate it.
All right. Welcome. Thank you for having me here. My name is Mychal Odom. I'm a contributor to the Burning Spear newspaper. Burning Spear newspaper is the longest-running Black Power newspaper in continuous print. It's the organ of the African People's Socialist Party. The African People's Socialist Party is a revolutionary, anti-colonial party formed in 1972 after the military defeat of the Black Power movement, with the purpose of reviving and completing the Black Power movement, what the African People's Socialist Party calls the African Revolution of the 1960s. In relationship, so I want to salute Chairman Omale Shatella, the architect of African internationalism, the theory that informs my research here, as well as my position on today. I just want to say that I appreciate this as a forum. I don't necessarily see it as a debate because, you know, as Marx did talk about, right, ideas don't just simply fall from the sky. Ideas emanate from our lived conditions. And the lived conditions of African people in the United States has been for 406 years as the primitive accumulation through which American capital has been produced. It's been 600 years through which African people, not from me, but from Marx, African people, indigenous people, people of India and things like that, served as the primitive accumulation for capital, right? The primitive accumulation for capital, it was the colonization of Africa, the enslavement of African people, which kicked off a process which pulled Europe out of feudalism into capitalism, which can allow for members of what people can understand as the U.S. as the left or something to find some sort of progressiveness in capitalism. You know, Marx and others spoke of it as sort of having progressive features, but it only has progressive features because it pulled European people out of feudalism. But it pulled European people out of feudalism through a process that, put the rest of the people of the world in misery. And that's the central contradiction. The central contradiction that we're speaking of today is the contradiction of colonialism, and that colonialism, when it is not simply in the African internationalist understanding a policy, right? And it's surely not a relationship between one settler colony and their parent colony. It's that sort of logic that in the 1970s had the United States upholding Ian Smith as an anti-colonial revolutionary, because it was in that time in the 1960s, not the 1970s, because he was heralded by the San Diego Union Tribune in the 1960s as a lion tamer, because the Union Tribune argued, like the American revolutionaries, broke off the shackles of British colonialism. It's the same reason why the people of the left, some Marxists and things like that, even people I really look up to, I think his name is James O'Connell, if that's correct, Irish socialist, heralded in the late 19th century and the early 20th century the Boers and the Boer War in South Africa, because of the fact that they were seen as being anti-colonial because of the fact that they also stood up to the British. But of course, we do not see spouts amongst the bourgeois ruling class as true revolution. I mean, of course, it's not true revolution. It is a response to a certain moment of crisis, imperialist crisis. The United States Revolution did not simply emerge in a vacuum, and it did not simply emerge through tea or people and guards staying in sorts of homes and things like that. We know that the founders of the United States were land speculators, right? We know that Virginia was essentially the outgrowth of the Virginia Company of London, and we know that as well that people like Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, and others had expectations upon the completion of the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, that westward migration across the Appalachians would open up, and they'd be able to expand. Which is why, of course, we know in 1787, one of the first things that's done is to get rid of the proclamation line and to allow for westward migration and expansion. Because the contradiction, of course, which leads to certain aspects of the American Revolution, but also other contradiction inside the American colonies, had been the struggle between the white poor and the white elite. That had been a problem for 100 years. 1676, Bacon's Rebellion, as well as other spurts between the white poor and the white ruling class. But the problem that exists in that framework is that the struggles between the white poor and the white ruling class in the framework of colonialism can always be resolved, or at least increasingly resolved. I think right now we see a set of contradictions that no longer allow for it to be simply resolved the same way it used to be, because of the rise of China, rise of Russia, and the dwindling American hegemony internationally. So I wanted to simply bring that forward, right? One contradiction that the United States has is the same contradiction that the same contradiction that birthed Israel, and of course, and things like that, right? The real tricky thing, the real devious thing about settler colonialism is that settler colonialism is produced in many ways by parent colonies, parent nations, exporting their oppressed to to the nations of indigenous people from around the world, and then their oppressed become the ruling class of that other place, and possibly sometimes struggle against the people whom which originally exported them. But that's all in the process of becoming one with the big bosses of imperialism and colonialism. So the contradiction, of course, is not that the emergence of the United States does not dissolve the system of colonialism that produced capitalism and the dominant world order through which we live under nowadays. It simply made room for the United States inside the system of colonialism and capitalism. So no, the United States Revolution was not a United States, the American Revolution of the 1700s in essence was not revolutionary, right? Slavery was not simply some sort of externality, some sort of minor contradiction that will be resolved over time or anything of that sort. It was a contradiction that the founders of the United States understood very clearly to be a central contradiction, as Edmund Morgan calls the central paradox of American history. So let's just see. What is revolution? Revolution is not simply change. Revolution is transformation, right? So revolution is not a caterpillar turning into a bigger caterpillar. Revolution is a caterpillar turning into a butterfly. Revolution, as for African internationalists, is the overthrow of the colonial capitalist state and replacement with black power. Because we speak of the American left, but the African People's Socialist Party does not exactly identify itself as a part of the American left, because even this idea of the left or the right emerges out of the French Revolution, but that is a struggle between two segments of French colonial society. Right, the primary contradiction is the contradiction of colonialism. One group of people living at the expense of other group of people, one nation of people living at the expense of another nation of people, and that can only be resolved with the complete overthrow of the system of colonialism. The American Revolution, of course, did not do that. Of course, the American Revolution extended that system of colonial domination. And in the years that followed the American Revolution, we saw more African people imported, more indigenous land stolen. And so this is the central contradiction. So therefore, a revolution, or what does it mean to be revolutionary? And a revolutionary, therefore, is one participating in revolutionary organization, right, for the purpose of overthrowing the colonial capitalist state, and in our understanding, replacing it with a state run by the toiling masses of the world and things of that sort. So there's so many other things that is important to understand. In highlighting those contradictions, I have about a minute left. So in highlighting those contradictions, I think it is important to underscore the presence of truly anti-colonial revolutionary ideas during the American Revolution. These are African people such as Thomas Peters, David George, Olaudah Equiano, Ata Bakoguano, and so many other people. You have people like, what's his name now? One minister who essentially said, at the very moment I thought I was lost, my dungeon shook and my chains flew off, right? This was Richard Allen, Richard Allen was also an important leader in early black society, African society within the United States, the founder of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. But that dungeon shaking for him was the American Revolution. The promise of the American Revolution for Africans was that colonizers were killing colonizers. That's to be clear. And if slave masters are killing slave masters, then it opens up a certain set of contradictions for which you can find freedom. So some Africans found freedom on different sides of the line, but that was an important struggle towards freedom. Lastly, we know that the first true revolution to take place on the state level is not the American Revolution, it's not the French Revolution, it's the Haitian Revolution. So we heard reference to Marx's letters to Lincoln. That's essentially chronicled in a book written by Robin Blackburn, who wrote about this. Even though but if Robin Blackburn, I think, was really going to do his due diligence, he would have written about the correspondence between anti-colonial Irish activists at that time and anti-slavery writers such as Frederick Douglass and others in the 19th century. We would have heard about Frederick Douglass's "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," which is very important because it raises the contradictions that are the United States, but it does sort of offer a way forward. That way forward is to truly create a world of peace and dignity. But one last thing I'll say is that for African people to be free, the irony here is that we have to wage a struggle for democracy against a democracy. We have to raise a struggle for real people's democracy against a colonial democracy. That's what we have to. The highest form of true democracy is self-determination. And that cannot be done within a settler colonial nation. That cannot be established within the system of oppression. It has to be established with true freedom. But it's the duty of the revolutionary to make the contradictions of the colonized not simply their own contradiction, but you have to make it the contradiction of the colonizer. And that's what, at moments of imperialist or conflict between colonizers that the American Revolution represents, that's what the strongest of revolutionaries have always done. Thank you.
All right, hello. So my name is Park. I am, like Colin said, the co-founder of the YDSA chapter here at UCSD, but I also am affiliated with other organizations both on and off campus. And I guess this is my first time doing an official panel, so I'm really excited to be here and to discuss the points laid out. So in my opinion, the first and most natural question we must ask if we are to answer the overarching question of this panel, which is America's role in the revolution, is to look at the past and determine whether these past revolutions were indeed true revolutions or not, and if they actually succeeded in materially improving the conditions of the working class or the proletariat. And so, arguably, the most well-known revolution in the hearts and minds of the American people is the quote-unquote revolution of 1776. So if we determine that this event was a revolution solely off of the terminology that is most commonly used and ignore the glaring misnomer caused by the latent petite bourgeois influence within neoliberal historical thought, then petite bourgeois revolutions such as the revolution of 1776 could falsely be defined as a revolution, even though they did not substantially increase the quality of life for the majority of the existing American population, and specifically furthered capitalist development and, ironically, furthered the exploitation of the proletariat in the United States. So we will first observe the history and determine for ourselves whether or not it could even be classified as such. So we first delineate the causes and reasoning behind the revolution of 1776, and as we go forward, I will only refer to the events that occurred during that year as such, not because I agree with the classification. Inherently, it is a false classification, but because this is how, unfortunately, it is known to the majority of people. So the British, after defeating the French in the Indian Wars of 1763, had full hegemony and control of the North American continent. With this newfound freedom, they could, independently of any other great power in Europe at the time, fully reap the fruits of this relatively untouched land. And the fruits included the labor of the natives, as well as like the natural resources existent within the North American continent for the good of the industrial heart in England. They decided to do this by dividing the American land amongst themselves and decreasing the level of autonomy that the American merchants and traders had once enjoyed. I believe the ratio between the proprietors and the English nobles was like 20 to 80, so it's a very clear, stark difference. They implemented laws that prohibited the additional expansion to the western lands. A number of manufactures were banned, and harsh taxes were imposed on the American bourgeois by the British elite, with the eventual goal of eclipsing the wealthy American colonialists and to make their land their own. While this was happening, wealthy American merchants and traders who initially migrated to the New World to improve their conditions, whether it be socioeconomic conditions or political conditions, they were aptly fed up with the increased tax burdens and the decreasing of manufacturers existent within the colonies at the time, and this resulted in the subsequent decrease of their surplus value, which was extracted from the land. And only because of this reason they rebelled against the king. It was not for the good of the working class at all, but to inherently push back against these laws that reduced their total surplus value. In other words, they only cared about themselves, the bourgeois. The American colonialists, to realize these ambitions, utilized the plebeian peasants that made up the bulwark of the lower societal strata by falsely proclaiming that their interests rightly correlated with the wants of the poor working class, which is inherently false. In essence, the entire conflict, from start to finish, was simply to determine whether or not the hands of the masters of the masses would change. The Native American genocide, which was ongoing before, still continued, and even after the war, it raged on with relentless fury, along with the primitive accumulation with regards to the land. This pattern is unfortunately all too common within other nationalistic and innately profit-driven movements based in the United States that have been misconstrued by the public as those with revolutionary ideals in mind. In my opinion, the majority of revolutions, quote-unquote revolutions, within the United States were intra-bourgeois conflicts. In fact, the first actual movement that was led by the people in the United States were, in my opinion, the unionist movements that arose in the late 1800s. I believe that they were one of the few examples that actually somewhat fought for the working class and marginally succeeded with the passing of a few neoliberal-esque reforms, which caused the limiting of the working day, the building of infrastructure to make the conditions of the factories safer, and the total eradication of child labor existent within the factories at the time. Although in retrospect these reforms were extremely gradual and pale in comparison to the emancipatory policies that would be granted to us under a true socialist government, they still had a somewhat positive impact on the working class and helped to raise the consciousness of the working class as it pertains to the late 1800s. Now I want to discuss the current socioeconomic base and situation of modern-day neoliberal society, which is today. As evidenced by the victories of Trump in 2016 and 2024, a considerable portion of the American working class are disgruntled and look towards right-wing politics as a way out of this externally imposed hole, insofar as the right-wing party can keep up the facade of having the proletariat's true interest in mind. To make up for its glaring failures in the role as the benefactor towards the masses, they regularly spout lurid and incensed comments, unbased comments at various minority groups in order to satiate the anger that the right feels. This anger, in my opinion, is not unique to people identifying as right-wing. It is an anger that we all innately feel, one that is accelerating both in tempo and intensity with every passing day. It is the anger that naturally arises living under constant surveillance and financial oppression. It is akin to the anger felt by the Bolsheviks during feudalist state Russia under the Tsar, the anger felt by the Chinese peasants who had their souls practically owned by the landowners. It is the anger that has fueled both successful socialist but also fascist overthrows. The difference in the anger lies not in itself, in its essence, but where the anger is directed. The capitalist class fundamentally understands that this anger that the masses have has the potential to threaten their global position. And as such, they invest enormous amounts of capital into reducing that rage away from themselves, either through media or altogether realigning it to where it benefits them best. And right now, it is towards the innocent migrants and minorities in this country. The question then becomes, is America ready for a socialist revolution now, given the underlying anger caused by wildly inane contradictions in US society? And what is America's role in the emancipation of workers worldwide, either through the concept of the nation state or as a homogenous people of workers? I firmly hold the belief that the potential to transform the American working class from a mere instrument of global oppression to a participant and a leader in the global emancipation movement is existent. But in order to arrive at this salient point, we must first address and eradicate completely the nationalist and quote-unquote exceptionalist fervor underlying the majority of the working masses. This false notion of American exceptionalism is intrinsically tied to the myth of the founding fathers and how they were an unreachable beacon of excellence in the fields of democracy and freedom. And these purported truths are today virtually indistinguishable from the current American ideals. And I believe that this artificial glorification of the founding fathers and our so-called exceptionalist circumstance on the world stage is actually harmful to building real revolutionary potential within the states and thought. Defining history as some sort of mythological retelling of what actually happened is detrimental and hampering, and completely ignores the breadth of resistance and fighting towards actual liberty and democracy that average working class people have fought for in this country. If we are to move forward as a movement, we should strive to realize that the magnificent things built on this earth were done so all by people no smarter or greater or more exceptional than you or I today. If we continue to focus on this idea of American exceptionalism and how the founding fathers were a one-of-a-kind character who had some unrecreatable trait, it is dangerous because it reduces the potential for community solidarity and change. History has shown us that if the proletariat fights with each other like they did in the construction of the Soviet Union, the rebellions that occurred in Europe during the early 1900s, then we can cause real impactful change. The methods to enact this community-driven response from the proletariat and the lumpen proletariat are passionately debated even till today. But I believe that it differs from nation state to nation state. We have seen the implementation of socialism in both feudalistic Russia as well as feudalistic China and how they successfully integrated socialist ideals with their own nationalistic ideas. But I'm skeptical if it'll work in the United States. The United States proletariat is and has been, after the end of World War II, the best treated proletariat in the history of society, which is saying something considering that just last week, 44 million people lost access to their food due to SNAP EBT getting shut down. However, speaking in terms of raw GDP and wealth extraction and imperialism, we are indisputably the best treated proletariat relative to our global southern counterparts. The world has also changed a considerable amount and has been reoccurringly shifting towards neoliberalism. I hold the belief that only through immense economic struggle and the realization of the disparity of wealth will the revolution occur. But I will not dismiss the importance of mutual aid or political education as a means of raising up a baseline amount of understanding towards a certain threshold, but real-life experience is unfortunately the best teacher. And for better or for worse, the contradictions of capital are intensifying and are not slowing down. We have seen with our own two eyes the utter devastation across the world, and the material conditions are ripening for a radicalization of the workers very soon. The inevitable tide of anger will be ours to control and maneuver if we act with diligence and efficiency, but it can just as easily reverse in the opposite direction. Our role as a political party and movement based in the United States is to distinguish between the type of rhetoric and organizing that will be used for various workers, i.e. educating the blue versus white collars differently with different rhetorical standpoints, and to improve the fraternity between us and unionists, lower class people, through mutual aid, political education, and infrastructure building, so that when the time inevitably comes, we have a solid base of both people and infrastructure to rely on. In my opinion, America's role is specific, but it's also not exceptional, at least in the way that people believe it is. What makes America's role specific is its position within the global capitalist system as the main antagonist and enforcer of imperialist natural and labor resource extraction. We have the potential to disrupt the flow of capital in one of its most critical junctures. When the Unionists working in an American port refuse to build weapons that fund a genocide overseas, they strike at the heart of the system in more ways than the proletariat in, say, England or Italy could do, although these issues are still relatively important for their own existing proletariat. We are exceptional in the sense that we have a moral obligation, as well as the very real possibility, to strike the capitalists where it hits them the hardest, the United States. In conclusion, our work needs to be disciplined and focused towards the effect of labor and education and building infrastructure. We also need to stop this sort of false narrative that we're some exceptionalist country and that we have some unrecreatable standards of history, because that's just not the case. I think that that sort of mindset is actually harmful, and it oftentimes destroys movements instead of building them up. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Now that opening statements have concluded, each of you will have 3 minutes to respond to anything that the others have said. After that, we'll have the audience give some questions.
Thanks to the rest of the panel for your great speeches. Some comments. I think maybe apt is to discuss what even revolution is. Maybe we could say that Marx's Promethean task in what he did was helping us realize that reality is revolutionary. In some sense, we are always already subjectively changing our consciousness into the already existing objective determinations in reality. In other words, the mode of production is always already changing from capitalism into socialism. It is our task as revolutionaries to respond to that adequately. What that means is that we respond to that task in the circumstances that we have, whether they are flawed or whatsoever. They are never going to be perfect. So when we ask ourselves what a revolution is, it's not necessarily going to be perfect at all. We know this to be the case in revolutionary history. Michael Parenti was very good at explaining this. As he explained, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, these were great developments. Were they perfect? No. The American Revolution, it was a progressive development. Was it perfect? No. The question is, where do we draw the line? We draw the line as we relate to the change in the mode of production and the subjective determinations of consciousness as they relate to these revolutions. In other words, it is important for us as Americans to embrace our revolutionary history. Otherwise, we fall into what the Chinese call historical nihilism. This is their exact criticism of the Soviet Union, who after Khrushchev's speech completely denied all of Stalin's achievements. This is a massive error, and the same thing cannot be done for America. We need to recognize the achievements of the American Revolution, whether they are imperfect or incomplete, and so on. So to respond to some more specific points, to understand the unique situation we have now, we may think that, we are in a situation of counter-revolution against the MAGA Confederacy. But this is not the case. The counter-revolution was completed many, many decades ago. All we are seeing now is bourgeois infighting between Democratic governors and Trump. What we have in America is indeed a form of American exceptionalism, and we should reject that. We don't have American exceptionalism in the form of how good America is, but also not in the form of how bad it is. Every single nation was premised on the displacement of indigenous people and the slavery and subjugation of certain populations. That is not unique to America. We need to not moralize about this, but recognize how we deal with that particularity in America. Yes, there are racial issues in America, but as we have discussed, the primary contradiction is one of class. I have much more in common with all of you in this room than I do with Kamala Harris or Kash Patel. We need to be united on a class basis and recognize that as the primary contradiction. We can recognize the developments from Lenin to Nkrumah and so on, and that is exactly why in the ACP we hold events such as Free America to Free Palestine. Only by adopting a revolutionary perspective and strategy in America can we hope to achieve liberation for those colonies abroad as well. So I guess I would say in my final determination here, recognize the American Revolution as a progressive development. recognize the good in it, recognize the revolutionary strands of history developing from that revolution, recognize the good in it, recognize the bad as well. Do not glorify either side. But if we are supposed to be the revolutionaries pushing America forward and trying to be the best example of what America can be, then we need to exemplify the good. Thank you.
I want to really bring this down to the question of how we be revolutionaries right now. I think the challenge for us really is to look, it's very important to look at what the past is, and we have great opportunities. The 150th anniversary, the right wing is going to just be an onslaught of uncritical praise about the uniqueness of American colonialism and its exploitation and its progress, and we have to fight back on that territory. But the main struggle really is, what do the people want and need, and are we going to be with them? Are we going to be struggling with them and being part of those movements? Where are we in the fight against today's Gestapo, the ICE raids? Liberation Road is part of the City Heights Defense Committee, and we're out there literally every day, working for the rights of immigrants and defending immigrants. This is where the real dividing line is on where it is. Questions of work and the conditions of work and the increased exploitation of workers and the amount of capital that's going to the top 1% or the top 1% of the 1% is something that has to be fought out, and we have to be in that struggle. It's the unaffordability, as Mandami said, and I think my challenge to everybody up here on the panel and all, what do we learn from the Mandami, what I would call a seismic victory for the left in this country, and what it tells us about how we need to reach and be working with millions of people in all kinds of fronts, including the electoral front, for the health of the people, for the food of the people, for the rights of the people. We have to engage, we have to be there with them and be part of those struggles. And thank you all for nodding.
Right on. So I want to salute this panel. I want to salute Martin. Many years ago, many different ways, cut my teeth as a young student, and then later on a student activist and things like that, in spaces organized by Martin, even in times in which I don't know if he quite remembers. So we're looking at over 20 some odd years ago. So this is all very important. I want to say that revolutions have happened within the United States, but those revolutions have happened against the United States within the United States, and it was the United States, even some of those revolutionaries that are on our money who crushed the revolutions that happened within the United States. I want to say that in 1773, 3 years before the Declaration of Independence, African people in Massachusetts had already petitioned for freedom, and people so we saw this trend was already happening. Going back actually to 1760, we see some of this activity already taking place. And we're not just talking; we're talking about organized resistance in response to the contradictions of the day, but also in response to the rhetoric of the American patriots of that time. See, the duty of the anti-colonial revolutionary truly is to, once again, make the contradiction that you're facing a contradiction for the colonizer. So if there is any usefulness in the language of the people who framed the United States, is that you can use that language against them to produce a new world. What is a revolution? Marx, salute to Marx. But we know that much of what we understand as communism, socialism that exists right now exists because of Lenin. Because Lenin is the first one to truly, really give a mass face to socialism, organized face to socialism, and to say that say that revolution was the dismantling of one state and the creation of a new state. But to do that, you needed a workers-led vanguard party. So I'll just say this. Yes, I want to argue that there were mass movements, revolutionary movements that took place, but I really think it's a deep contradiction that the first real mass movement is therefore going to be the abolitionist movement, right? The movement to end abolition, right? What are we talking about in socialism? We're talking about giving power to the workers, right? We're talking about unionism. W.B. Du Bois writes about the only, what he calls real general strike to ever take place in the United States was when all of the enslaved people in the United States left the plantations, right? That was the only real general strike ever to take place in the United States. And the problem with the labor movement that was created in the late 19th century is that it was oftentimes created against black workers. And the ones that were successful were such as the Knights of Labor were created alongside black workers. But they were crushed. So we're at time. So I just want to say then the Garvey movement, the Civil Rights movement, the Black Power movement. These are the revolutions that happened within the United States, but they happened against the United States. Thank you.
Well, I'll just like to say that in the superset that is revolution, there are various forms of revolution that are possible, right? There's a socialist revolution, which I hope is what we're all fighting for, but there's also things like a capitalist revolution. There's also a fascist revolution. And so when we talk about really sort of implementing a real socialist revolution, it means, having, exactly like you said, a vanguard party led by the proletariat, a dictatorship of the proletariat is what we need for a socialist revolution to actually succeed. And I don't think that the revolution of 1776, again, it wasn't a revolution at all in the sense that it wasn't socialist. It was a revolution that it was intra-bourgeois. For the point of electoralism, I think that Zoran's campaign was very historic. Obviously, he won with volunteers and mass volunteers in New York City, which I find to be really commendable. But I also find that some of his points, especially now that he's been backtracking on the genocide going on in Gaza and hanging around with AOC and Bernie, who have also in the past denied the existence of a Gaza genocide, is pretty telling. I think that electoralism is good. There are certain benefits to it, but again, we have to be nuanced in that. While electoralism can shed more light to the ideals that we're purporting, I don't think that the capitalist will just allow some socialist to really go through the traditional avenues of power production and social power production. That is what electoralism is, right? And yeah, I agree with your point. I think that I did have a huge misstep on my part for not including the Black revolutions. I think that those were really the true ones. I did miss out on that. Yeah. That's it. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. No, we're not going to go into the question and answer section, in which we invite everyone here to raise your hand, and I will call on people for Hussein to pass the mic to. Can anyone open up over here, please? Yes. Thank you. Who wants to take it
thank you so much for agreeing to be on the panel. I have a question, and I think this question is, for me at least, trying to very much so get clear on the idea of does America's wrongs invalidate its possible rights? And I think the lens in which I want to ask, find the answer to that question and your opinions on it would be post-revolution, post-socialist revolution, would there or should there be an America? Or do you think that America as a concept, as an institution, as a state, as an et cetera, is so corrupt as needing to be utterly replaced or abolished, et cetera?
Well, I'll go ahead and answer that. First off, I think that there are a couple different premises, right? So I think that there's a very subjective sort of reasoning around, wrongs, rights. Is it so evil that it has to be thrown away? I mean, damn, I think the Raiders got to be thrown away. You know what I mean? At least Geno Smith. You know what I mean? Like this is crazy, my man. He couldn't make a pass with a telescope in his, So that's not the main. But the question is, what is a true socialist revolution? And everyone forgets this, right? See, the main limit of what became the Soviet Union was that the Soviet Union was never supposed to be a country. It was supposed to be the venue through which you have no countries, right? What Marx calls the withering away of nations, right? He might have talked about the withering away of the state, but we talk about the withering away of nations and African internationalism, and you can't have so I would argue that it's not just that the United States should not exist. In a true socialist revolution, no countries that we have should exist, right? But a true dialectical and historical materialist investigation lets us understand that even the nation state as we come to understand it nowadays surely didn't exist in 1776, right? And has only really existed for about the last 101 years. In the common understanding of what a nation state is and our ties to the nation state. Only citizens can vote. That stuff ain't even as old as the United States. That stuff ain't even as old as the 20th century, right? These are recent constructs. So constructs produced through colonialism and capitalism and things like that. So yes, I think that the truth is that in a true socialist revolution, no countries will exist, right? We have to abandon the concept of socialism within a country. That is so those are real communist and socialist questions, I think. So I think to limit it to the United States is kind of like a gotcha question. The truth is that in real socialist revolution, no countries will exist. Not how they exist now. In that sense.
I'll interrupt and try to keep this to a minute so that we get a lot more.
A minute? How long are our responses?
What, I don't know. Nobody's set the rules except you and I. The U.S., like many imperial countries, is a prison house of nations. Yes. Prison house of oppressed peoples. The native nations of this, Puerto Rico, Hawaii, Alaska, and Aslan. But the important thing here, and what I really hope we turn our discussion to, is how are we going to turn this around? The United States has something to celebrate. There are many things that have progressed, but right now we are on the doorstep of a growing fascism, and we have to really decide how it is we can turn that around. And I think that everybody here has a role in doing that. We cannot let there be a consolidation of fascism. And when I say that, I'm saying that this is not fascism, otherwise we wouldn't be having this in anything except, a hidden garage. So we have to prevent fascism from really taking power. And if we do not do it now, we're going to be, for a couple of decades, stuck with the inability to democratically change systems.
Regarding your question about the U.S. existing, I think we have to be honest. I was at a debate tournament this last weekend where a high schooler argued that all white settlers in America should move to Antarctica. Okay, that student went on to the quarterfinals. This is probably an indictment of the debate community as a whole, that we allow such argumentation. America, yes, is a prison house of nations. It is a unique prison house of nations, one in which many immigrants are here due to brain drain and other kind of capitalistic tendencies. But the United States is here to stay. The white population here is here to stay. There is a white working class. They are not just all settlers. If you go to certain communities in America, you will see impoverishment of the white community just as comparable to any other. Now to the second point regarding dialectical materialism and the withering away of the state. Yes, we, at the end of the day, hope that there is some end goal of communism in which there is a stateless, classless, moneyless society. But as we know, history unfolds dialectically. When Lenin discussed the withering away of the state and when they founded the Soviet Union, they recognized there was a need for a new economic plan, that it was impossible to immediately abolish the state, and that to do so would immediately invite counter-revolution from abroad. So when we talk about that, and we talk about this existing fascism that we say exists in the US, people may say that, oh, there is not fascism now. Of course there is fascism now. Fascism is the terroristic dictatorship of finance capital, as described. So what we have is that we have a completely dominated financial system. The only distinction is to what extent is the repression at any given time. That repression may increase or decrease, but the point is the same. Right now, we have that dictatorship. And so the only solution to that is the development of a communist party able to organize against these tendencies. And so when we talk about defeating fascism, the solution is not to fall into electoralism or Mamdani. We should recognize these as ultimately failures, that Mamdani and the democratic socialists that are trying to win through electoralism will be shut down the same way they were shut down in 2020, in 2016, and so on and so on. Many of us who are in the ACP initially had these beliefs that we could be Bernie bros and just vote away what we thought were the ills of America. But this is obviously not the case, and what we'll see in Mamdani, and I will stake my name as a communist on it, is that he will fail, that New York will remain the way it is, and I hope that we can really participate in real revolutionary organization.
Oh, so are we still discussing with each other?
If you have something to say based off of Minnal's response there, and Park needs to talk first.
Let's
because
hear from more questions. Okay.
So I guess I'll preface this by saying that like modern historians believe the idea of nationalism, which is the connection between one's personal identity and the nation that one lives in, to start really at the advent of the Napoleonic Wars. More specifically, during the Napoleonic Wars, Napoleon needed more men to fund his army so he could go on his imperialistic voyage across Europe. And in doing so, he related the idea of the nation state to the people in order to further galvanize the proletariat into fighting for the imperialistic capitalistic wars that was innately the Napoleonic Wars. So as much as nationalism is a very existent factor in political society today, it can just as easily be reversed and removed.
And one thing I'll just say real quick is that the counter-revolution had already started against Russia or the Soviet Union, and it had nothing to do with internal contradictions within the Soviet Union or the speed through which they moved towards creating a state, a stateless society or something like that. It already had existed, right? First off, the contradiction that was the contradiction between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks turned into the contradiction that we still see taking place all the way right now between the conflict between the Ukraine and Russia, even though we know that Russia is a completely different society than it was in 1917. We know that the origins of that was the the imperialist countries of the world lining up against the danger of what they saw in the Soviet Union. But that is the solution. That's to suggest that the only way forward there is to continue to organize the masses of the world in a borderless, stateless a revolution. And I mean, that's to me logically the only way forward. But yeah, thank you. I've seen you before, so.
Oh, I got this one. Yeah. Yeah. So, the country doesn't have a lot of strong leadership right now. The Democratic Party is very decrepit, and the Republican Party is just led by Trump doing all of his crazy shit. And there is this new bright and shiny face, Zoran Mamdani, who's going to become the new Democrat guy, like as you guys pointed out. And like a smart politician, he leveraged the existing volunteer DSA machine that was in his city. He won the seat. Like a smart politician, he's not going to bag himself down by going on about Israel or something like that. It would be foolish. It would not be successful. And my question to you guys is, the left basically is a collection of people with alternative ideas, but without any sort of institutional political power in the United States. And my question is, do those ideas have something to offer to the leadership of America? And if so, what? Or the leadership of the country, like in the way that I think of, John McCain saying he was going to lock up the Wall Street guys in 2008, being leadership. So what he's doing, it is political leadership. So what are the ideas of the left, or what exists on the left today, have to do with leading the United States as a country? Or what does the left have particularly to offer that the Democrats don't have, that Zoran doesn't have? Like, what's the particular thing the left has to give to a country that needs leadership, which our country does?
Senator, do you want to start with that?
Because I'll probably be better off responding, because I mean to essentially assume that the role of the left is to simply just be another think tank for, I think the contradiction is, in the question is to assume that the role of the left is to be simply another think tank in support of one party or another, or both parties, is the central contradiction. It's not the central contradiction, but is paradoxical and doesn't get us to where we believe. As the African People's Socialist Party, as we said, sort of the African People's Socialist Party believes that the highest form of democracy is self-determination. The truth is that it's not simply the people who vote in every election. It's the people who don't vote who need to be mobilized for their collective voice. But it has to be one that speaks towards essential contradictions, is that the United States is a country that was built on genocide and slavery and colonialism, but not simply as just simple bad ideas, but as a mode of production which produced the world in which we live nowadays. So the only way forward is to sort of overturn that. Now, electoral politics matter because one doesn't want to cede any territory to the opposition, but in that sense, it's of course not the end objective. The end objective has to be freedom. The end objective has to be into the colonial capitalist domination of the masses of people of the world. But I think that what my organization has to offer is something called the National Black Political Agenda for Self-Determination. In 2009, we created the Black is Back Coalition for Social Justice, Peace, and Reparations. And that's a mass, anti-colonial, anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, a coalition of organizations, so an organization of organizations. And we have a 19-point agenda which lays out what we believe freedom looks like, and it stands as a platform through which all elected officials of all races, ethnicities, nationalities, we believe need to unite with as a test of really being freedom loving. So I would say, organizational power. And things of that sort, but if anything, like I said, is to give them the collective voice of the masses of the people. But the masses of the people have to be masses led by the most oppressed and colonized sector of our society. If not, then what we just end up with is socialist colonialism. So look back at the 1908 Socialist Conference in Stuttgart, Germany, in which socialists literally got together and argued. Some of them argued in favor of a new form of colonialism, but it would be a socialist colonialism that would help advance the backwards races of the people, because if you can't really get rid of colonialism just yet, because where are the socialist countries at that time going to get the resources to build their socialist nations and things like that? So what we're saying is we don't want that. We don't want socialist colonialism. We don't want fascist colonialism. We don't want democratic colonialism. We want freedom, self-determination. Thanks.
Yeah. So you're asking what are we offering the?
What does the left have to offer in terms of leadership to a country that needs leadership, because the current parties are not, really delivering? Maybe.
Yes. The way I would answer that is that we need to develop the struggle of the people, by the people, for the people, and we have to be in there. We can take something, and I would take the victory of Mondami in New York very, very seriously. Is it perfect? It's far, far from that, but it is exceptional. We need to understand how profound a change this is for somebody who is an outsider in terms of immigrant background, in terms of being a Muslim, in terms of being a democratic socialist, to gain a victory over the money of the billionaires is extraordinary. So rather than saying this is going to fail, we should say, what can we do to make this succeed? And that is to be among the imperfect movements that exist constantly when we are working. The example I'd like to bring out is right now there's a transformation going on in Mexico that's quite profound. It is not in any sense a socialist revolution, but it has all of the trappings of that. And it starts out with the fact that they are changing the concrete conditions of the people. And so the Mexico Solidarity Project wants to learn from that, wants immigrants to take up the kinds of struggles, to follow those struggles here in the U.S. and to bring that to bear on the immigrant, not making the perfect the enemy of the possible, but actually to help develop workers' power step by step and not rejecting when it's not perfect.
Okay, so I think your question was, what does the left have to offer in terms of ideas and leadership and things like that, right?
Like
okay.
Leadership to a country that is not assimilable to the Democratic or Republican parties, the way maybe
So I guess what I would first say is that there's a famous quote, which is that you cannot be a communist unless you fill your mind with all the treasures of mankind. I think that that is first and foremost the case, that communists should be the exemplary people in this country leading the way. And that in doing so, we realize that there is good news. There's no reason to despair. We are in the best situation possible. We should be optimistic about what is going on. We should not fall into nihilism, and we should find the good in our history. I think that's what communists can offer at the very least, a kind of refinding of the real revolutionary history of America and the development of that into a real revolutionary party. I think the way that that can be done, fighting for freedom and sovereignty, we like these words. What does that mean materially or practically? I think in one sense that means reskilling America. We've been deindustrialized for some time. One of our members here, Huey, he's actually a member of the working class, has been teaching many of the members of our party how to actually control the material reality around us. That means relearning these skills that many Americans have lost. Basic things that Americans no longer can do that now require large corporations to take over. Carpentry, electrical work, so on. These basic things, that control of material reality is what is one thing at the very least that can help. Now, what does that mean for the working class, or how does that lead the working class? I think, the famous quote that we are showing the proletarians the manner in which they can, the reins of power and the manner in which they can break down the society as it exists. So by showing proletarians that, yes, you have these skills, and if you organize those skills in a meaningful manner, you can do the job of the capitalist without the capitalist. They need you, we do not need them. I think that reskilling is part of it. I think that won't end up in a kind of socialist colonialism, because I think that's just really an incorrect understanding of what socialism is in the first place, and if there were socialists that thought that way, they were wrong. And I think that in regards to Mamdani, the most important thing that we can offer is to point out the inevitable failures so that years from now, people will point and say, wow, their theories seem to have some kind of prescience to it or some kind of predictive capability. And by doing that, people will recognize the power of that theory. So both in the practical sense, what can the party do for the people, and the theoretical sense of what we can impart in terms of our knowledge. Those are the two things I would say.
Park, you're welcome to respond, but I'd also like to get more questions from the audience. Yeah? All right. Okay, can we get one in the front row here, please?
Thank you. I coming from one of the most attacked communities right now, migrant community, Latino, Mexicano. And one of the questions I'm really concerned is, I don't hear the word unity, which I think is very essential in these moments. These guys in power, I say these guys because it's not only Trump, it's a whole group of people. Silicon Valley, some people from Silicon Valley, the right-wing evangelists, residuals of the Tea Party, among others. And to confront that, I think we need the left to really understand the reality we live in, to come out with a project of unity, to confront this system to try to consolidate right now. Because if we let it consolidate, I don't know for how long it's going to be this oppression. Then the call is for unity. Let's go try to work it out, especially on our communities to come together.
Okay. I got another question right here in the alley.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Huey. I want to thank the panel for being here and for having this discussion. I think it's important. My question is, if I may kind of prelude the question with, so Lenin wrote a letter to American workers in 1918. If you haven't read it, I highly suggest it. But in that letter, he opens with this paragraph: "The history of modern civilized America opened with one of those great, really liberating, really revolutionary wars, of which there have been so few compared to the vast numbers of wars of conquest, which, like the present imperialist war, were caused by squabbles amongst kings, landowners, or capitalists over the division of usurped lands or ill-gotten gains. That was the war the American people waged against the British robbers, who oppressed America and held her in colonial slavery. In the same way as these civilized bloodsuckers are still oppressing and holding in colonial slavery hundreds of millions of people in India, Egypt, and all parts of the world. The reason I say that is I ask because we are a Marxist-Leninist party, and as Lenin says, who was the father of the first workers' state in the world, how do you guys square your understanding of the American Revolution with how he sees the American Revolution for what it's worth and how it should be considered by people in the future as a truly revolutionary war?
Start, or do you want to? Yeah. Pass that on.
So I haven't actually read the letter that you're referencing, but it sounds very interesting, especially considering the fact that Lenin was pretty critical towards the American imperialists and the American regime. I think he said somewhere in another letter or some other text that America had become like this very industrialized society, some very militarized, very violent nation state that is only like really justifiable, or I guess like not justifiable, but provable through the lens of like its genocidal past. And so I guess I would ask you then, what would you make of that?
Well, I think Lenin was a materialist. I think that he understood, as Marx talked about, you have to go through a bourgeois revolution in order to get to a socialist one, right? Because as we all may talk about wanting a society where we are in a classless, moneyless, borderless society, right? What is actually, materially, what does that look like, right? That looks like the ability to give everyone what they need. And under a feudal system, that just wasn't possible, right? You need to industrialize. You need to have a base of proletarian workers to make the shoes, to make the houses, to build the roads, in order to ship the things that all society needs to prosper, right? So he saw the American Revolution, as my comrade Minnal said, right, as the first successful break with British imperialism and colonialism, and saw what the forward trajectory of that was going to be. So while yes, it was not perfect, and there was genocide, there was destruction, but the industrialization is an important aspect of getting to where we want to go as a stateless, moneyless, classless society.
I would agree on some aspects. I think like materially or like dialectically, it is true that in order to get to a socialist society state, and thus after a communist state, you do need to have these sort of like class contradictions within pre-existing modes of production. So obviously there was like the very famous contradictions between feudal societies and capitalist societies, and the problem of feudal societies was that they weren't, like you said, industrialized enough or really connected to the global market enough so that they could really further the cycle of capital. But I think what he was trying to say is that it is inevitable, but it's not a good thing, and it shouldn't be something that is of a hollow nature. It should be something that we should learn from, and something that we could ultimately, learn from, so that we can actually create a socialist state, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and in doing so, I want to ask you, so are you suggesting that bourgeois revolution had taken place in the Soviet Union, or are you suggesting that the Bolshevik Revolution was an event that set the stage eventually for some sort of bourgeois revolution that would then follow with some sort of true proletarian revolution? Because that's essentially one that you got to clarify that if you to raise the other questions.
The revolution in the Soviet Union in 1917 was a socialist revolution. It brought forward the first workers' state in the world. The 1776 revolution, in which he is referring to in his letter to American workers, absolutely was a bourgeois revolution. I don't think that's debatable at all. It's to say that without the bourgeois revolution, you cannot get to a socialist revolution. You cannot create the material situation for a socialist revolution without going through the bourgeois revolution. And to your point, I don't think that as Marxist-Leninists, we don't look at things in a good or bad. We don't moralize, right? Society is full of good things and bad things throughout all of history, and through all of the work that we do, there is the bad and there is the good. It's not about moralizing. It's about what reality do we live in and how do we deal with that reality in order to further our goals.
So are you saying that the American Revolution was the bourgeois revolution that set the stage for the success of the Soviet Revolution? I'm just trying to get clarity around the relation between bourgeois revolution that you're outlining and socialist revolution.
Well, bourgeois revolution.
Or are you saying that there was a bourgeois revolution that took place in Russia that set the stage for the success of the Bolsheviks?
No,
Because the Chinese might say that. The Chinese might say that in 1911, what happened in 1911 set the stage for the Chinese Revolution, but I think most people would argue completely against it. Most people would argue that what Marx talked about has never actually taken place in Russia, China, Cuba, and Vietnam, Haiti, and everywhere else suggests that it's actually not that, this sort of bourgeois revolution, because especially if the bourgeois revolution resolves the contradictions within the bourgeoisie. If it resolves the contradictions within the bourgeoisie and leaves the main contradiction at play, which is the oppression of the most people of the world against others, then I mean, because that's suggesting that sort of, that would then suggest whatever's happening inside the Knesset or whatever in Israel in opposition to Netanyahu is on the same standing as what the Palestinians are fighting for, and it's just not.
May I interject here? This will be our last question. It's almost 8 p.m. and
But
we
I appreciate
need to clear out of here.
Also like to point out that
Yeah,
you said that
microphone. One last one.
no, it's okay. You said that there's an absence of morality in Marxist-Leninist thought.
Mike, it just
I mean,
Martin's like, I got the mic, jeez. That's close enough.
Yeah, I just want to ask again, did you say that there was an absence of morality in Marxist-Leninist thought?
There's an absence of moralism, not morality.
Moralism, okay. So I'd like to contest that point. Like in the first few pages of the Communist Manifesto, it clearly states that socialism is the most moral and really truly fair mode of production, and so that's a complete mischaracterization in my opinion. So.
I want to make a quick confession. I at one point owned the 45 volumes of Lenin, and I asked myself, why didn't I own 45 volumes about the state of the ruling class in the United States and the role of workers? The reason I say this is because, on the question, why aren't we talking about unifying the left? Why aren't we talking about how to build the movement right here? Because that's what we should be uniting upon. We have to unite to meet the needs of the American people and to lead that struggle for change, to recognize what it is that they are rebelling against, that they would move, and in the absence of the left offering something is the reason that you get some kind of charismatic madman able to convince, as a billionaire thief, that he has the interests of the working people. This is where we need to be in the public square and talking about and studying about. That's where we need to do. We sometimes, those of us on the left, knew more about the Russian Revolution or the Chinese Revolution than we do about the US Revolution. And the real thing that we need to be studying is the conditions of the working class and how to move them towards a position of becoming, fighting for self-determination of all people, but to give them the sense that they are the owners of and the makers of history. And we have to be there alongside them, whatever that condition is.
Thank you. Now, Minnal, you have 2 minutes to close this out.
Okay. I guess first on the question about moralism, right? This question is related to the obsessions of the Western left as we kind of exist currently. The Western left has become obsessed with, as Carlos Garrido, our education secretary, would call it the purity fetish. That everything has to be pure. We have to be pure people. The revolution has to be perfect. We have to obsess about the morality of these things. This is an error. We're not saying that morality does not have a place in Marxism, Leninism. We are just saying that the tendency of the Western left as it existed in the last couple decades has been flawed along those lines. Now, secondly, regarding bourgeois revolutions, we know that the bourgeois revolutions heavily inspired a number of the socialist revolutions, even though those social revolutions maybe didn't exactly transition through a bourgeois capitalist stage, such as those in China and Vietnam and so on. But that is related to the specific particularities of their modes of production and economic realities that those people were facing, different than what Marx was describing in Europe. And we know that Marx was wrong in his predictions about Europe being the first place to have these revolutions and so on and so on. But nonetheless, Ho Chi Minh, Mao, Lenin, all of these characters were deeply inspired by the American Revolution. Nonetheless, we are in America. We are contesting with our history as Americans. And so when we are trying to find unity as Americans, we are trying to find unity with Marxists amongst Marxists, not unity between Marxists and the distorters of Marxism, the famous quote by Lenin. So when we are trying to adequately find unity, the first thing to do is to set up our political line correctly so that we have the correct interpretation of Marxism-Leninism and the correct application of it today. So to do that, I think we need to not fall into historical nihilism, not reject our history as completely negative, nor accept it as the right wing might say completely positive and be overly patriotic or super patriotic, as Michael Parenti would say. We need a realistic, objective determination of the concrete situation in America, any number of words that we can use to make sure that we are facing reality directly, not obsessed with morals, not obsessed with ideals, not obsessed with theory, but actively contending theory with reality and working on the ground to achieve the real aims, the real socialist revolution. Thank you.
I want to apologize for having to cut this panel short, but that's why we're going to be meeting downstairs at Dirty Bird's Bar and Grill after this. Could I get a round of applause for our panelists, please?